Know thyself. The problems of narcissism and identity and the bewildered farce of identity politics. The central philosophical clarion call echoing down through the centuries has been, know thyself. This philosophical maxim was inscribed upon the temple of Apollo at Delphi, and since the 5th century BC, it's been recognized as a vital element in a wisely lived life, though this maxim has been interpreted slightly differently by philosophically minded writers of every epoch. A principal meaning of the phrase in its original application included the nuances of knowing one's limits, knowing one's faults, knowing that one is merely human, and that such humility might protect us from hubris and help us to realize our true nature, the proper measure of ourselves, and a proper place in the cosmos. A common takeaway, however, has also been that the embodiment of this maxim is not easy, seldom fully achieved, and often not even attempted. Though overlooked by modern psychology, which from its inception is barely a century old, has been that it's divorced itself from its close cousins of religion and spirituality. This very theme is reflected at the onset of Ovid's version of the myth of Narcissus and Echo, the myth from which narcissism was first named over 2 millennia ago. For his version of the myth opens with Narcissus's concerned mother engaged in a consultation about her son with Tiresias, the famed seer of the Greco-Roman mythopoeic world. Tiresias had a unique reputation for discerning the future, as had the oracles at Delphi for nearly 1,200 years. Though unlike the oracles at Delphi, who had been inspired from breathing ethylene fumes, the explanation presumed for the insight of Tiresias is that he'd spent part of his life as a woman and the rest as a man. He thus achieved a non-polarized balance in his vision that gave rise to an ability to see what others could not. What else do I want to say about this? Anyhow, the point is what Tiresias tells Narcissus's mother about her son. He says, Narcissus will live to a ripe old age. And then he pauses before he completes his thought, for then he says, providing that Narcissus never comes to know himself, for that would surely lead to his death. What are we to make of this prophecy? First, I think, it's safe to assume that there must have been something kind of disturbing about Narcissus that led his mother Laocope to consult with Tiresias in the first place, though we are not told what the problem was at first. However, from what we were told at first, it might have something to do with identity, for Narcissus will only come to live to a ripe old age providing he never comes to know himself, for surely that would lead to his death. Having pondered this myth and this utterance for some time now, my takeaways have come to be multiple. First, though it's true that all bards are poets, not all poets are bards. And unlike most of the other poets of his time who gave their renditions of this myth, Ovid was, by my estimation, also a true bard, and thus capable of rendering the myth in ways most useful for individual and cultural transformation. In this light, the nuances Ovid employed were capable of speaking to multiple ontological levels at once, while giving the myth a more timeless and universal relevance, the very elements that the other versions of the Narcissus myth had lacked. For Ovid seemed a practitioner of the bardic skill of speaking from both sides of the tongue at the same time. In Ireland, where traces of the old bardic tradition still can be found, it was thus said, "A poet speaks from two sides of his tongue, though only one of them blesses." And so the death of Narcissus that occurs at the end of the myth is both a literal and a metaphoric death. And thus, at the metaphorical level, Ovid seems to be telling us that self-knowledge is deadly to narcissism, and perhaps why the most malignant of narcissists seem to avoid any pursuit of self-knowledge like the plague. And today, you won't find them in therapy's consulting rooms unless mandated by the legal system. Since a central thread in this fabric of words concerns the injunction to, quote, know thyself, let's talk about knowing. The words knowing and gnosis are etymologically related, both stemming from the Proto-Indo-European root gnu, that's G-N-O, or know rather, meaning to know. Yet the Greek word gnosis specifically evolved to describe a more profound, intuitive, or spiritual kind of knowledge, precisely what Ovid possessed, and often associated with hidden mysteries or divine insights as distinct from ordinary discursive analytical knowledge. Should we manage to let go of enough of our ordinary cognitive filters, another kind of knowing may become active in us. And what the skillful means of the more Gnostic parts of our spiritual traditions attempt. But for the most part, I found that it serves me well when I confess to being a moron at times, the other side of my tongue, and don't claim to be some version of the Delphic oracle. These oracles were always women, and unlike them, I've never delivered prophecies, probably of any sort, but certainly not those inspired by ethylene vapors. Though from time to time, like many in my generation, I have dabbled in other entheogens, yet without depending upon them to access or maintain innate depths available to us all. However, as a man who'd spent the first 40 years of his adult life working as a licensed psychotherapist, I would say this, that the issue of identity, as Ovid wisely noted, and in particular a mistaken identity, is rather central to narcissism. For in a sense, narcissism is not only a personality disorder, but an identity disorder, one in which people take themselves to be what they're not, often by an over-identification with their self-image. This results in a disorientation toward one's authentic being, which becomes lost in the shuffle. And this loss of authentic being can begin quite early in life, when parents or family members are so self-absorbed, so out of touch with their own being, that they become incapable of mirroring and supporting the very presence, the beingness of a child. The child then often adapts by trying to be whatever the surrounding holding environment might be capable of recognizing. This loss of essence is the fall into personality, or what has been described as the marketing strategy of desperate children. And we might recall that our word personality derives from persona, the Greek word for mask, which originally referred to the large masks worn by the actors in Greek tragic dramas, so that the audience sitting in the cheap seats could recognize the characters being portrayed. And to the extent that a child's deeper nature failed to be adequately seen and supported, they can lose touch with it, while their adapted yet fictitious self may be fairly well adapted to a culture of other adapted selves, yet they will also suffer from an ontic deficiency, a hole in the soul that they attempt to fill with what has been termed narcissistic supplies. And the many decades I've worked as a psychotherapist leads me to find that this is far more common than in the 0 to 6.2% of the population estimated by the American Psychiatric Association to suffer from narcissism. While the longest-running study on narcissism in the U.S., conducted by a group of social psychologists over more than 2 decades, came up with vastly different figures that jibe more with my own clinical findings, namely that approximately 2/3 of Americans had and would likely again score highly on a narcissism index. For instead of a quest to know thyself, narcissism attempts to fill what's been missing through quests for fame or things that might confer status, such as a lofty business empire, associations with high-status people, maybe 100,000 followers on social media, luxury cars, homes, or yachts, or in an extreme case, the possession of a gold toilet. While in his myth, Narcissus uses erotic conquests as his means of acquiring narcissistic supplies, and thus he leaves a trail of broken hearts behind. Echo is but one of many, and the trail includes male lovers as well as females. In fact, in Ovid's version of the myth, one jilted male lover raises a prayer to highest heaven, asking that Narcissus be doomed to failing at love, even in the love for himself. And this prayer, a curse really, was heard by wakeful nemesis. So who or what is Nemesis? Nemesis was a female Greek deity whose mission was to pursue those who had succumbed to the crime of hubris. She was thought to have an exacting sense of proportion, by which she could determine those who had violated rightful bounds and who had thus lacked empathy for others. To this end, Nemesis was often depicted holding a measuring rod or scale in one hand and a sword or whip in the other. With her measuring devices, she could determine those who had violated proper bounds, and with her whip or sword, she would pursue and punish them. And in the ancient world, hubris was recognized all over the place, much as narcissism is starting to be recognized today. In fact, hubris was the central character flaw in the protagonists of ancient Greek tragic dramas. While in modern political history, we might see that a narcissistic hubris has been the downfall of despots, brought down by the nemesis whoever pursues them, such that it's never a matter of if they will fall, where, merely when. For whether in a bunker in Berlin, a hole in the ground in Iraq, or hung from a rope in Italy, they will get theirs in the end. And even should they have managed some form of immunity during their lives, history will judge them harshly in the end. Aristotle found that it is good to study history, for it provides a helpful perspective that could serve to protect ourselves and our nations from hubristic acts and hubristic actors. And in fact, healers often begin healing processes by taking a history, for it can provide hints for healing and reveal what's been tried that hasn't worked. This brings us to consider identity politics. What's meant by the term? As Jessica Kohler writes in a Psychology Today article, partisanship has evolved into a core social identity for many individuals. This phenomenon, often referred to as identity politics, means that political beliefs are closely tied to personal identity. As a result, people are more likely to view political affiliations as integral to who they are. This deep connection makes compromise and dialogue increasingly difficult, as any challenge to political beliefs is perceived as a personal attack. Well, we've had deeply held political divisions within nations and between left and right, at least since the late 18th century, when Western democracies began to emerge and contend with the aristocratic divine right of kings. This, for example, was the case in France, and where those in favor of the king sat on the right side of the aisle in France's governing body, and those in favor of democracy sat on the left side. Here, identity politics led to excesses on the part of the left, with over 17,000 guillotined during the French Revolution against the monarchy, including King Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette, as well as commoners considered enemies of the revolution. But the death figure here pales by comparison with the excesses of the left on the part of Mao's great proletarian cultural revolution, where Mao's version of identity politics caused between 1 and 2 million people to perish. What's different today is the impact of social media. For not only for its broader public reach, but for its capacity to reach niche audiences, and because people now tend to seek out and consume media that aligns with their pre-existing political beliefs, a behavior termed selective exposure. In America, prior to the internet and cable news, there were just 3 major television networks, and we had a Walter Cronkite as a widely respected arbiter of the news. That's no longer the case. We've suffered a profound change within my own lifetime. I grew up in Washington, D.C., a political town. And throughout my childhood, when my dad would take me to the ball games, he'd point out the congressmen and senators in attendance having a beer together, often those of opposing parties. And the year that Richard Nixon and Senator Estes Kefauver from Tennessee were running against each other for vice president, I happened to play in a softball game with them at the annual Washington Press Corps picnic while wearing a Washington Senators baseball uniform. And after the game, these 2 political opponents each placed an arm around my shoulders as we posed for a photo op. And it was widely known that Tip O'Neill, though the Democratic Speaker of the House, was actually a good friend of Republican President Ronald Reagan and a golf buddy of Gerald Ford. During the day, they could be fierce opponents, but after 6 p.m., they actually enjoyed each other's company, It became a joke between friends when either O'Neill or Reagan, two Irish guys, would call the other on the phone and ask, "Is it 6 p.m. yet?" Well, that's no longer the case. For American politicians today, when it comes to their political opponents, it's never after 6 p.m. And instead of a political commentator respected by both parties, we have partisan media sources such as Fox News on the right, or CNN and MSNBC on the left. And by continuously consuming content that echoes their beliefs, individuals today become ever more entrenched in their political views. Today, neither Donald Trump nor any Democratic Party leader would be caught dead playing golf with each other. For today, the other party has become viewed not as the noble opposition, but as an existential threat. Our political responses have become more extreme, with support for more extreme policies on one side of the aisle and more hostile behaviors toward outgroup members. And what has nearly been lost is the kind of bipartisan support that a healthy democracy needs to be capable of in order to pass legislation that is truly needed at a time. Instead, American politics has become a zero-sum game, and what has been badly damaged is the ability to more objectively side in favor of what's best for the people and the planet as a whole, and to place that above party. In this regard, I've come to have the utmost respect both for Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, who both fell on their political swords with honor, though it cost them their political future. The word for that is integrity, and we should learn to recognize and honor it better whenever it appears, and not to vote for it when it doesn't. In reflecting the above, though there's been excesses of partisanship on both sides of the American political divide, the excesses of late are not equal or in that way the same. The Fox News channel is no longer really even a news channel. In fact, it's become a propaganda channel more resembling Pravda. And for nearly a decade now, the Republican leader has been an unprincipled liar, and now a convicted felon, as well as arguably a malignant narcissist, a sociopath, and a psychopath to boot. For if one suffers from a personality disorder, it is very seldom the case that one suffers from one personality disorder and that one alone. And what does it say about the level of discernment in America that such a man could be elected to the highest office in the land, and not only once? And so a deeper point, though one yet to get much play from either the left or the right, because each suffers from it, is that identity politics is, in a sense, little different from narcissism, for both suffer from a confusion of identity. In narcissism, it is one's self-image that becomes confused and conflated with one's identity, and thus in a knee-jerk way, it must be constantly promoted, say, via selfies and social media, while defended through multiple means, which is like promoting and defending a husk, a shell, surrounding one's deeper nature. That shell is what Gurdjieff termed the personality, and the very thing, he told us, that needs to be made passive in order for essence to become active. Nearly all the world's spiritual practices are meant to effect this very shift. While identity politics is equally bewildered, for in no real way is our deepest individual nature existentially threatened by the beliefs of others, no matter how polarized or batshit crazy. There is, however, an enormous cultural cost at every level, politically, morally, environmentally, spiritually, when significant and polarized parts of the culture become dissociated from what's more deeply true and then abandons or fails to protect the culture's core values. For then you could wind up being led by a buffoon-like emperor wearing no clothes, while the sycophants he surrounded himself with constantly reassure him of how elegantly he is dressed. If enough citizens don't wake from this nightmarish farce and call a spade, America could wind up losing the inheritance left to us by our founding fathers, while also losing our allies abroad, and wind up as an isolated pariah state, as has befallen other dysfunctional autocracies. In America, for the past 80 years, people believed that such a hostile takeover could never happen here. But that's what people who've suffered a political holocaust also once believed. Perhaps what's happening now in America is an example of a nation that has failed to learn from history. And yet the challenges of global warming alone make our epoch different from any other, for what's at stake now couldn't be higher. When Gurdjieff was once asked what would be required for people to accelerate the rate of their spiritual development, he succinctly replied, increased necessity. And the great Swiss psychiatrist C.G. Jung said something remarkably similar. What he said was, without necessity, nothing budges. The human personality least of all. It is tremendously conservative, not to say torpid. Only acute necessity is able to rouse it. Hopefully, the dire conditions we're facing now, from global warming to the rise of fascistic autocracies, will provide the increased necessity for humanity to make a needed evolutionary leap that has otherwise failed to occur. In America, the run-up to that leap may be visible in the mass protests against the ill-willed ineptitudes of the Trump administration now appearing throughout the land. Yet if a pivotal number of us continue to follow the dark and narrow path of identity politics, it shouldn't take a Delphic oracle to conclude that our lack of self-knowledge will only lead us further toward a dystopian midnight. We're on the clock now, and the clock is ticking.